Hello GeoGeeks and welcome back. In this video, we're going to cover how to install XMing, why you might want to install XMing, and what it does. And then once we get XMing installed, I'll show you how to set up some reasonable default for a really simple bare bones text editor called Netit, or some people call it Netit, but it's their Nirvana editor. It's quite an old editor, but it's graphical, it has syntax highlighting, and it supports basic stuff that you're probably used to, like copying and pasting with Control-C and Control-V. So I think if you're new in your GeoGeek journey, it's a pretty good editor to start with. And I will admit that I still use it sometimes because it's a decent editor. It's also available on all Linux distributions through your package manager, at least all the ones I know of. Okay. So the first step to getting XMing installed, so the first question is, why would you want to install XMing? If I open up my terminal window, which is going right now, what you will find is that if you try to open up a graphical software package, you can't do it. You don't have a Windows manager. And so, this is something foreign to people that are used to Windows or Mac machines because the window manager is built into those operating systems. But Cygwin, since it's based on Linux, but we're not really running a Linux system, you have to have a graphical manager, like a file, it's called an XServer, in order to be able to run graphical packages. So for example, if I click on this PC, that opens up explorer.exe. But all of these, like the X button, the square, the minus sign, all these other things, the edges, how they're decorated, the scroll bars, most of that stuff is controlled by DWM, the desktop Windows, desktop Windows Manager. And that basically establishes all these rules. So you probably noticed in an operating system, when you open up a window in almost any program, they share many of the same characteristics. Whether you open Windows Explorer or Google Chrome or something, they're both going to have these same basic window decorations. So if we want to start getting into editing stuff, like maybe our bash_profile file, you can't use a graphical text editor through Cygwin because you don't have an X Windows system installed. The editor I'm going to show you is Netit. And what it'll say is can't open display because it doesn't have an X server running. So Cygwin does come with an X server, but what I've found is that the XMing version of X Windows is a little bit lighter weight and it has a little bit better performance. So I switched to it, 10 or 15 years ago, and I've been happy with it. So for example, you can run text editors inside of a terminal window. For example, there's a text editor called Nano, which is very old school and kind of neat. And you can see this is the contents of that bash_profile file. And it does syntax highlighting too, which is pretty cool, but you can't copy and paste in it and stuff like that. Maybe using the middle mouse button you can, I don't know. But it's very basic and it only works inside of your terminal window. There are times when this is actually good, but for the most part, I think when you're doing stuff, you want to be able to have a graphical window. So XMing provides us that sort of environment. And in Linux, that environment is called the X Windows system. So you need an X server in order to serve these windows. So what you need to do is type into Google XMing, of course, because Google knows stuff, and you'll be taken to this SourceForge page if you click on the first link, and that's sort of the free version of XMing that's out there and available. And what you'll need to grab is the fonts. You probably don't need the Deja Vu fonts, but you'll need to grab XMing fonts 7.10 or whatever. The fonts are updated very rarely. You can see it was updated 6 years ago, but the actual XMing server itself you download by clicking on the button, and it looks like it's 6.9.1, so it's quite an old version. So if you go back, you'll see that there's also this straight running website, and as far as I know, this is the official site of the author, Colin Harrison of XMing. And what you can do is he updates the software quite often, and you can actually donate to him and it'll give you a donor password. I think the donation is something like 10 or 15 US dollars. It's in euros, so it depends on the exchange rate. And that'll give you access to updates for about a year. And I've started donating to him because I think XMing is pretty cool. So that's what I'm going to use when I install here, because I think it just runs a little bit better. But again, I haven't had any problems with old versions. So use whichever one you want. You're going to need XMing fonts, and you're going to need the XMing installer. So this is the rel_64 XMing. You can see that this is 7.7.0.79. This is quite newer than the one that's on SourceForge. Let's go ahead and install it. It's pretty straightforward to install. It is 64-bit. You'll notice it installs in program files, not program files x86, which is cool. It does have OpenGL capability, although I haven't had a great time getting it to work well. You don't need desktop icons. You can just leave all the defaults here. It's all good. It takes a couple seconds to install. And then what you can do is you can hit launch XMing, and that's pretty cool. And it might give you some sort of warning about the firewall. I usually just say yes, let it launch on everything, because, you know, if I'm on a laptop and on some Wi-Fi hotspot, I don't want to get a warning with XMing. This is the icon down here that shows you it's running. We can see that. Let's see how lightweight it is. I'll pull up the task manager right now, which is going to be huge. Yeah, it looks like it's running about 35 megabytes of memory, which is pretty good. Back in the old days when I used to run the Cygwin version, I think it used more resources, but it's not a big deal. You can right click on it and there are some options, which basically I never use. And if you double click on it, I don't know if this is a feature or a bug, but it actually crashes and you have to restart it. So don't double click on it, at least the old versions. Now that you have XMing installed, what we should probably do is shut it down because we don't have any fonts. So let's install the fonts. And it should automatically detect that program files XMing directory. Yeah, it says it already exists. Yes, we want to install there. And I usually grab the 100 DPI fonts just in case. I don't think you need Cyrillic or Deja Vu fonts, you know, unless you use a language that uses Cyrillic, like, you know, Russian or something. Just keep hitting next. You're probably thinking, why is he making a video on this? Well, there's a couple of really minor things that you can do that really make life a lot easier, and that's what I want to cover. So what it's doing is it's installing all the fonts. This way, when you do graphical programs and they use different fonts, you'll have those fonts available. So basically, XMing will work properly. Now, here's the thing, is if we try to open it, since I closed XMing, if I try to open Netit right now, it's going to say it can't open the display, right? Well, that's not good. That's because XMing's not running. It has to be running all the time. And as you saw, it's pretty lightweight. So what I do is I install it in my startup folder by default. That way, every time, the startup folder on Windows is a folder where every time that user starts up, all of those programs that you put in there automatically start. So it's a pretty quick way to sort of automate something without having to write code or anything. So first, let's find where XMing is. There's XMing. And what I want to do is right click on it and hit Open File Location. That way I have a shortcut that I can copy and paste. Now, here's the cool part. Yeah, the finding your startup folder is kind of a pain, but there's a really cool shortcut to find it. If you hold down on the Windows key and R, that gives you a prompt to run. And the command you should type in there is already typed in there. shell:\startup. And what that will do is it will open up your user's startup folder. This is just for your particular user. And then what we can do is we can put XMing, copy it with Control-C and paste with Control-V, of course. You can put that in your startup folder, and now every time you launch into your user account or reboot or whatever, XMing will automatically launch. I think that's worth its weight in gold. So I went ahead and started it up again just so we could have it there running. So let's open up our terminal window again, and let's try to open up Netit and see what happens. Sorry, it shouldn't take you this long to open a terminal. Again, my computer thinks it's on a domain, so it's waiting for the domain to answer. There we go. There's Netit. You can see it looks very 1990s or maybe even 1980s. It's quite old school. But what you will notice is, I have 200% font scaling on, and that font is still small for me, even at 200% font scaling. So let's look at some of the preferences in Netit to help us get a better experience. So what you can do is you can see there's a whole bunch of settings down here, but what we want to do is go into default settings so we don't have to keep setting these over and over again. Number one, I like to turn wrap off. No, not that kind of wrap. Because a lot of times you're going to be dealing with data files in, geophysics and earth science and geology, whatever, environmental science, where there's a lot of data per line. And what it will do is it will automatically wrap it to the next line. And that's really quite annoying, I think. Continuous text wrapping is nice if you're like typing, but if you're writing code, you really want that off. I don't want to see what's on the next line unless it's actually the next line. So let's change that. Auto indent's good, wrap is good, tag collisions, tab stops. By default, when you type tab, what Netit does is it gives it the same amount of spacing as 8 spaces. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but what happens is if you're writing code that has a lot of different nests in it where you have to indent, with 8 spaces, you can get your code pushed over really far right on your screen pretty quickly. So what I usually do is I usually do 4. And also, coincidentally, that's the same that MATLAB uses by default, so it works out nicely. But that's enough that you can see that the code's indented, but not so much that your code will get pushed way far to the right and you have to scroll over. Text fonts, oh boy. There are not a ton of fonts available for Netit. It's one of its weaknesses. It doesn't have a dark mode either. Dark mode wasn't a thing when Netit was written in the 1990s. So this menu is super duper confusing. So here's what I usually do. It looks like it's using a 14-point font by default, which you'd think would be big enough, but that's pretty small. So what you can do in here is you can just click a different size, or what I usually do is look for a size that looks reasonable, and then you can just change that number to 24, and then fill highlight fonts from primary. Cool, it didn't give me any errors, which means that size actually exists. You might think, can't I type any number? No, not in this software. So if I fill in 25, see it says it does not match primary, because usually that means those are not compatible. It's not a valid size. So let's use 24. Depending on your screen resolution, you might also want to consider 25 or 26, something like that. But I think 24 has worked well for me in the past, and I have huge font scaling on, so I think that will work. So fill from primary. So everything's 24. You don't want your italic font to be different. Well, maybe you do. I don't. I don't want to mess with colors or menus or anything like that. I think the next thing all I really want to do is mess around with the default window size, because by default, the initial window it gives you is very small. So, oh, I'm already off the screen too. Holy cow. Whoa, I'm totally off the screen. It's because I have this huge font scaling on, so the menu won't go. That's really funny. Okay, so you can't see it very well here, but what will happen is you'll get the option to be able to change these things. And what I would recommend is just playing around until you get an initial window size. There should be one in here that's fillable. Let's see if I can make this stay. There we go. I can make it into a tear off. Come on, go up. Default settings, window size. I'm still off the screen, holy cow. All right, well, you should be able to fill in the blank there with something that's a little bit more reasonable. So let's go with 60 because it was, given to us as an option. Save defaults. It's going to save in your root directory, in your home directory. It's going to make a folder called .netit, and then inside of there, it's going to make a resource file or a .rc file that will tell it every time you start up Netit, these are the settings I want for you, which is pretty handy. That's one of my favorite things about the Linux environment, is that this stuff's all good. And not only is this stuff all good, you can basically customize the look and feel of everything you want. Let's open it up and see what happens. Probably going to be huge. Yeah, it's huge. But again, you'll have to fiddle around with this and get the right size for your screen. And then what I'd recommend is just write it down. Make like a text file in some directory that you back up, and just write down what your settings are. That way, if you ever have to reinstall Cygwin, you don't have to fiddle around with different sizes and whatnot. And I think that's pretty helpful. Okay, well, I think that's really about it for this video. This will give you access to graphical programs so you can open up windows. There's more than Netit. Let's see if this works. GLX gears, that should test your OpenGL libraries to make sure that your three-dimensional rendering is working fine. And you can make the gears small, or you can maximize them and let it run for a while. And this is just making sure that your system is able to render three-dimensional stuff. Usually works with no problem. There's a really fun program called Xeyes, which is just a tester to make sure that your X-server is working properly, and it follows your cursor around. It's kind of silly. It's really, really silly. Look at the eyes, whoa. So there's all kinds of fun stuff you can do with Cygwin and the terminal window. But we have our X windows running through XMing, and we have our text editor configured. So I think we can call it quits for this video. Stay tuned though, because in the next video, we're going to talk about how to edit your environment variables, which are all the variables that you start by default, and how to make aliases of commands, and how to change your prompt. What if you don't like that prompt? What if you want to change it? Well, we'll cover that in the next video. So come back for that. Stay tuned. Subscribe if you want to know when the next videos are coming out. I'll see you later, GeoGeeks. Bye-bye.